Realism in 1/35 scale can sometimes be tricky. With military settings and miniatures, contrast isn't always as important as with your typical tabletop miniatures. But especially when it comes to painting white clothing or winter camouflage generally, it may be deceiving that painting pure white isn't the right choice at all. For this figure, I tried to keep the transitions subtle and the tones slightly muted, so everything stays cohesive at this scale. If you're curious how I approached this figure, from the reversible anorak, the oak leaf trousers and the face, give me less than 20 minutes and I'll guide you through my process step by step. What's up guys, it's great to see you again. Let's jump right into the process of painting this figure. As a first step, I started base coating the pants. For this I used burnt umber from Ionic, and graveyard earth will later be used as a highlight color. For the base coat, I just try to apply a pretty even coat with just slightly thinned paints. I decided against a zenithal highlight with the airbrush this time because I wanted to show you that it's also easily doable just from a black primed base. This approach would also work fine on a gray primer base, so don't overthink it. At this stage, it's more important that you get a solid base color down on the miniature. From my own experience, it's not really necessary to thin down your paint that much, but if in doubt, just do it and apply the base color in maybe 2 or even 3 coats to achieve a smooth finish. Generally, I would encourage you to thin your paints more, the lighter the color gets. But that's still just a rule of thumb. The base color for the anorak will be neutral gray, which I'll then mix later on with pure white to gradually increase the lightness more and more. Just remember that if you want to paint white, that it makes sense to gradually build the color up step by step, or not just immediately paint white over black. But you will see that in more detail when we arrive at that step. The next step was to block in details that I overpainted during the base coat but wanted to be black for a better overview. This step is completely optional and I just do it because it fits my way of painting. Sometimes it helps to visualize contrast if you clean up certain elements. Additionally, I try to build up a few details that I want to be field gray with a greenish black, called cold black. But also this is not really necessary and did not make a big difference at all. But what made a big difference was the base coat of the fur elements on the boots and hood of the anorak. And for this I used graveyard earth, which is basically a very light brown. Since these parts are a bit more texturized from the sculpt, it makes sense to thin the color a bit more to make sure that it gets into all the details. We will build up the shadows at a later stage with a small trick I like to utilize and you can easily copy. I use Admiral Gray from Ionic to paint the parts I want to be field gray, like here in this example the scarf. If you make a mistake at this stage because you could not perfectly reach a detail with your brush, it's easy to fix it by just applying the base color over it again. That's why I like to paint in as much of the details as possible early in the process. Now I show you a small trick I like to use. I get the express color from Vallejo to bring back the contrast on the base coated areas. I like these colors a lot because they tend to dry to a nice flat finish. But honestly, all contrast type paints are viable for this. For me personally, these colors have made washes completely obsolete, because they go down into all the recessed areas and only slightly tint lighter painted areas. And if you want to create your own colors, you could also just get the medium of any of these color brands and mix your own contrast style paints. This would have been also a good idea for the anorak, but honestly, the slight bluish black tint is not a big deal. On the fur, the effect with the rich copper brown was exactly what I wanted to achieve and made the texture pop exactly like I had hoped. For the pants, I used a mixture of the black and brown paints to deepen the shadows in the recessed areas of the creases. And the leather boots pretty much got the same treatment for now. We'll give them a bit more attention later on. But for now I paid attention to building back the color of the anorak first. For this I went back over it with the base color neutral gray. First I tried to only paint the raised details, but I thought the contrast would be too much, so I decided to paint in over some of the recesses again. If you want a high contrast finish, make sure to only paint over the raised details and to keep the shadow areas under the creases dark. This may over-exaggerate light and shadow a bit too much in this scale, but can be an easy way to paint smaller figures quickly. But this time I wanted to stay a bit more on the realistic side, and therefore decided to build up the base color again, step by step. Don't be afraid to paint over the details, because when we start mixing in the white, to gradually increase the whiteness, the contrast with the neutral gray will still be sufficient to appear as dark shadows. I make sure that I get a solid base color again, and even though it may not have been as effective as planned, the contrast paint still had an impact on the overall look and definition. So I would encourage you to just try new things when painting, because the outcome can be surprisingly good and interesting, while still being simple. If you're interested, I could also do a more beginner-oriented video in the future, where I show you how you can paint figures like these easily in just a few simple steps. Let me know what you think. I use the same procedure for the pants by going over about 80% of the details again and leaving only the deepest creases darker. This creates a good basis for the next step, where I mix the lighter graveyard earth in our base tone burnt umber and start highlighting the details carefully. The same, just with different colors, is done with the jacket. I carefully added a tiny drop of P3 Morrow White into the neutral gray and start to highlight all the parts that make sense. I make sure to apply the paint in one layer after another and not jump too much. Remember what I said in the beginning. The lighter the color gets, the thinner I will make it, to make sure it still goes down smoothly. By building up the lighter color slowly, you have complete control over the areas you want to appear more white, while still able to correct them with the neutral gray at any time. If you are unsure, just start smaller and get bigger and bigger with each step. In the end, it comes all down to preference and the finish you want to achieve. And of course, also the material you want to recreate. If you paint a metallic surface, for example, it's completely fine to have bigger jumps and clearer borders between colors, and you would still be able to sell the more reflective properties of metals. For cloth, on the other hand, smoother gradients just make more sense. As mentioned before, the secret or trick to make something appear white is to not purely paint white, but to build up the color in steps. Of course, you can then, as a final highlight, use pure white paint. But if we stay with my example, I did not use it for the finish at all, but instead only mixes. The general approach for layering colors is to paint smaller areas of the material with each step, but that should depend on the painted material. Now I start blocking in the dark patches of the winter oak leaf pattern on the pants with black-brown. Here it became obvious that I could have gone with the lighter color as a base, because the patches don't stand out that much. I paint over them several times to get a better coverage, but the contrast between these colors is just too low. If you want to recreate this camouflage pattern, just keep it in mind. The base colors will be the same for the spring or summer variant. In the next step, I use brown, a lighter and more orange-brown color, to block in the next part of the pattern. Here again, since it's a lighter color, you will probably need to apply a few layers to have it cover well over the darker black-brown. Here I already start to apply the first dots, or blotches, to make it more similar to the original camouflage pattern. And then, as a final step, I use light rust, an even more orange tone, to create the final and lightest dots and splotches. I apply several overlapping dots and sometimes also a few single ones between the regular base color parts and the already formed pattern. You can easily go back and forth between all the colors to create a more outlined effect on the pattern and make it appear more irregular and therefore realistic. Slowly, with each step and repetition, you can finally see the effect and also the pattern form. One quick tip here is to not overpaint the seams on the clothes with the pattern, because these would be the parts where the pattern would have been broken up by a cut and seam. You can also introduce light glazes with the highlight or base color to adjust the lights and shadows and also make the pants appear more worn. But I would wait with this step until the end, when you have finished all elements. After a few repetitions between all the steps, this is what I finished with. I think it looks pretty good. For the fur elements on the hood, I just grab the initial base color Graveyard Earth again and start stippling over the texture to create a somewhat believable effect. I make sure to not paint too much into the recessed areas, which were toned down by the contrast paint. Here you could also easily create the same effect by dry brushing with a smaller dry brush or makeup brush instead of stippling, and it would work very good. I think a lot of times it comes down to preference when deciding for a technique, but generally dry brushing is always very effective if you paint a heavily textured area, while stippling can also be useful on completely flat surfaces. During this stage, I also paint the rest of the details to a certain degree, but will finish most of them only when I have the head attached, to have a good clue on how much detail and contrast is needed. For the canteen and also the bag on the back of the belt, stippling is a great technique for the highlights, to make these materials appear more textured. Decide for yourself if you want to try this out. In the end, the effect can always get toned down by glazes or washes, if you don't like it. So this is our figure so far. What do you think? Was it worth the effort? I'm pretty happy with the results so far. The contrast is fine for the size and all relevant details have a solid, not overdone level of highlights. Surely you can push the realism even more with refinement, but depending on the scenario and environment for the mini, I would always reserve these steps for the end, to make sure everything works together well with the base and included objects. But of course, we have an important part missing, probably the most hated parts for many of you out there, the head and especially face. Here I started with a zenithal highlight applied by the airbrush, but you could easily just dry brush the effect on with thinned down white paint. I start by applying the shadow color first and then painting in the lighter parts of the face. Try to achieve a solid coverage of the color over the primer, because this will make every later stage a lot easier and ensure that no gray or black spots will show through the paint. And try to ensure that every detail gets covered within this step. Since his head has a very prominent jawline sculpted, I make sure to apply the lighter highlight color there, which will have a subtle but still very effective result in the end. I have a more detailed video about painting faces, where I go deeper into every detail of the process if you are interested. Mix the colors together to soften the border, or step between the two and then start to gradually work up and down between the colors by mixing them. For parts like the cheekbones, lips, the nose and also the inner parts of the ears, I mix in a bit of the red into the skin color to create a more rosy tone in these areas. This can also be done with glazes, just be careful to not overdo the effect. Here again, it is the same approach as everywhere else on the figure. I try to make small steps between each of the colors to create a smooth look in the end. If you have the feeling that you have overdone anything, just make another mix or step between the colors, or just correct it with a few glazes of a midtone. Patience is very important with skin tones and faces, but I can guarantee you that it will pay off in the end. Also, please don't mind the artifacts in the video. Unfortunately, it seems that my capture card has decided to finally give up. But thanks to a good miniature painting friend of mine, replacements is on its way. Thank you, Sasha. Shout out to you. You can check out his amazing work on Instagram. It's definitely worth it. This time I also tried using glazes for the beard stubble effect and to bring lighter and darker areas on the face together. In the end, again, it just comes down to preference. Glazes are mixed quickly, but take some patience until the effect is visible, but make therefore slight adjustments easier. While mixing a solid color can take a bit longer until you have right tone, but then will have an immediate effect in the area of application. The final steps in completing the head are to paint the cap. I start by painting the visor and the belt black and applying the field gray base coat to the rest of the cap. I mix a lighter variant and start highlighting the creases on the cap. Here, stippling is also again very useful to create a 2D texture on the cap to replicate the material. Additionally, all markings are also base coated black again, and then gradually highlighted with mixes of grey. This step is not easy and requires some precision and patience. I make sure to just thin the paint slightly down to not flood all detail, but still need to make sure that the paint comes off the brush easily. If you have problems with these details, try adding a bit of flow improver into your mix. It can help significantly with these problems. And that wraps up the video. Now, since you have already seen the result at the beginning, do you think this result and process is something that you would like to replicate? I am pretty happy with the result and look forward to add this miniature to a diorama in the future, where I'll then take the last few steps of refinement. Unfortunately, there were a few defects in the cast, and small details like a spot on the chin, the cap visor, the pipe he's holding, and a few parts around the arms either broken or had small bubbles, which I did not notice in the assembly stage. But the sculpt was fun to paint and looks cool in my opinion. I will definitely look at a few of the new 3D printed figures from Dynamo Models and plan to paint them in the future, to see if these have even crisper and smoother details. Also, as I've mentioned before, if you're interested in a more beginner-oriented process that still leads to awesome results with just a few steps, make sure to let me know and I'll do a video about that. Additionally, if you liked this video, make sure to hit like, leave a comment or even subscribe to my channel for more painting-related videos in the future. It means a lot to me. Until then, looking forward to read your comments and see you next time. Bye!